She doesn't know you well enough yet, my daughter-in-law said when I reached for my newborn granddaughter at our Christmas dinner last year. And in that moment, surrounded by glowing lights, cinnamon candles, and the sound of Bing Crosby playing softly from the kitchen speaker, I realized I had somehow become a stranger in my own family. The dining room looked like something out of a holiday catalog. Brianna had made sure of that. Gold napkin rings. White roses floating in crystal bowls. Tiny silver snowflakes scattered across the mahogany table. My son Daniel stood near the fireplace with a glass of red wine in his hand while guests laughed quietly around him. Outside, snow drifted past the windows in slow, silent waves. It should have been one of the happiest nights of my life. My first granddaughter had been born just 3 weeks earlier. I had spent months knitting blankets, sewing little bibs by hand, and buying tiny pink sleepers from a boutique downtown. I even brought the silver baby bracelet that had belonged to Daniel when he was born in 1987. I kept it wrapped carefully inside velvet tissue paper in my purse all evening. But none of those things mattered once Brianna stepped back and tightened her hold on the baby carrier the second I moved closer. Maybe later, she added with a polite smile that somehow felt colder than the weather outside. She gets overwhelmed easily. I stopped moving immediately. My hands remained slightly raised for a second before I slowly lowered them back to my sides. No one at the table said anything. Not Daniel. Not Brianna's sister. Not even Claire, my daughter, who sat quietly near the end of the table gripping her wine glass so tightly I thought it might crack. The silence embarrassed me more than the words themselves. I forced a small smile and nodded like I understood. Of course, I said softly. I wouldn't want to upset her. Brianna relaxed after that, almost victorious in a way so subtle most people wouldn't have noticed it. But I did. I noticed everything that night. I noticed how she passed the baby around to her own parents 20 minutes later while pretending not to see me watching. I noticed how Daniel suddenly became fascinated with carving the ham whenever my eyes drifted toward him. I noticed the family photos lined along the hallway wall from their newborn photoshoot the week before. Brianna holding the baby, Daniel kissing the baby's forehead, Brianna's parents smiling beside the nursery crib. There wasn't a single photo of me anywhere. Not one. At some point during dinner, I unfolded the tiny knitted hat I had made for the baby and placed it carefully beside my plate. Brianna glanced at it briefly before continuing her conversation about sleep schedules and pediatricians with her mother. I sat there listening to strangers discuss my granddaughter, as if I were a distant neighbor who had wandered accidentally into their holiday celebration. The strange part was that no one openly insulted me. That would have been easier to survive. Instead, everything came wrapped in smiles, in soft voices, in careful manners. Exclusion dressed itself beautifully that night. After dessert, I quietly walked into the kitchen under the excuse of refilling my tea. The house smelled like rosemary, baked apples, and pine from the giant Christmas tree standing near the staircase. Through the doorway, I could hear Brianna laughing while someone snapped more family pictures in the living room. I stood alone at the counter holding my mug with both hands, staring at the reflection of the Christmas lights against the dark kitchen window. For a moment I saw myself the way they probably did now. Old. Unnecessary. Decorative, like one of the forgotten ornaments tucked into a storage box after the holidays ended. Then I heard the camera click again in the other room, followed by Brianna's cheerful voice. Perfect, she said. This is exactly how I wanted our first Christmas to look. Our first Christmas. Not family Christmas. Not baby's first Christmas with everyone. Hers. I looked down at the small silver bracelet still hidden inside my purse and suddenly understood something painful. I wasn't being kept away from the baby because of germs or schedules or parenting preferences. I was being erased slowly, politely, and very carefully from the picture altogether. I left Daniel and Brianna's house a little after 9 that night with the silver bracelet still sitting untouched inside my purse. Snow covered the streets in a thin white layer, glowing under the streetlights as I drove home through the quiet suburbs. Christmas lights blinked from rooftops all around me. Families gathered behind warm windows. Trees shimmered beside fireplaces. Everywhere I looked, people seemed wrapped inside the kind of holiday comfort I used to believe would always belong to me too. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my hands felt stiff against the steering wheel. I sat in the garage for a moment after turning off the engine, listening to the silence settle around me. 30 years ago, Richard would have been waiting by the front window the second my headlights appeared. He always stayed awake until I got home safely, even during snowstorms. Sometimes he would open the front door before I could even reach it and say, "You took too long. The pie is getting cold." I could almost hear his voice when I stepped inside the house that night. The Christmas tree in my living room still glowed softly near the fireplace. Wrapped presents rested underneath exactly where I had left them earlier that morning before heading to Daniel's house. One of them contained the little rocking horse I bought for my granddaughter 3 months before she was born. I had imagined placing her carefully on my lap beside the tree while Daniel took pictures. I had imagined hearing her tiny laugh someday while she reached for the ornaments hanging from the lower branches. Instead, the house greeted me with stillness so deep it almost rang in my ears. I removed my coat slowly and hung it by the door. Then I walked into the kitchen and noticed the tray of sugar cookies I had baked the night before still sitting untouched on the counter. Brianna had said she already prepared dessert and did not need me bringing anything extra. At the time she smiled when she said it. But now, standing alone in my quiet kitchen, I realized how carefully every part of the evening had been arranged. There had been no place for me there at all. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat near the tree without turning. On the television, the silence felt heavier than usual. My eyes drifted toward the knitted pink blanket folded neatly over the arm of the couch. I reached for it instinctively, running my fingers over the soft yarn. I had spent 6 weeks making that blanket. Every stitch carried excitement, hope, love. Suddenly I remembered another moment from months earlier during Brianna's baby shower. She had thanked every guest publicly for attending except me. At the time I convinced myself she was nervous and overwhelmed. Then there was the ultrasound appointment Daniel forgot to tell me about. The hospital photos posted online before I even knew the baby had been born. The canceled Sunday visits. The unanswered messages. One by one, the memories lined themselves up quietly in my mind like ornaments hanging from a tree I no longer wanted to look at. I stood up and walked toward the hallway where family photographs covered the wall. Daniel at 7 years old holding his first baseball glove. Daniel graduating college beside Richard. Our beach trip in Cape Cod the summer before Richard got sick. In every photo, Daniel looked at me with warmth, with trust. I stared at those pictures for a long time that night trying to understand when exactly that expression disappeared. Maybe it did not happen all at once. Maybe people drift away the way winter arrives. Slowly, quietly, one cold morning at a time until suddenly the trees are bare, and you cannot remember when the leaves vanished. Around midnight, my phone buzzed softly against the coffee table. For one foolish second, I thought it might be Daniel apologizing for dinner. Instead, it was a social media notification. Claire had tagged me in a photo she secretly took earlier that evening. Everyone stood together around the Christmas tree smiling for the camera. Brianna held the baby carefully against her chest. Daniel stood beside her with his arm around her shoulders. Brianna's parents leaned close beside them. And there I was in the far corner of the frame near the dining room doorway, slightly blurred, holding my purse against my chest like someone waiting politely for permission to belong. The week after Christmas moved slowly through the house like cold air slipping under a locked door. Every morning, I woke up expecting to feel better about what happened at Daniel's dinner table. But the feeling stayed exactly where it had landed that night. Heavy, quiet, impossible to explain to anyone who had not lived through something similar. I tried distracting myself with ordinary routines. I watered the poinsettias near the kitchen sink. I folded laundry while old jazz records played softly in the background. I drove to the grocery store during a light snowfall and smiled politely at strangers wearing Santa hats even though the holiday was already over. But no matter what I did, little memories kept surfacing at the worst moments. Brianna stepping backward when I reached for the baby. Daniel avoiding my eyes. That phrase repeating in my mind over and over. She gets fussy around strangers. 3 days after Christmas, Claire stopped by unexpectedly carrying takeout containers from the Italian restaurant near her office. She set them on the kitchen counter without speaking at first. Then she hugged me longer than usual. "You did not deserve that," she finally said quietly. I tried brushing it off the way mothers often do when protecting their children from uncomfortable truths. "Brianna is just protective," I answered while reaching for plates. "New mothers get nervous." Claire looked at me carefully before pulling out a chair at the table. "Mom," she said. "She handed that baby to 3 different people after she stopped you." I froze for half a second while opening the silverware drawer. Deep down I already knew that. Still, hearing someone else say it aloud made the humiliation feel more real somehow. Claire sighed and stirred the ice in her drink slowly. "This did not start at Christmas," she continued. "You know that, right?" I sat down across from her without answering. Outside the kitchen window, the snow had started falling again in soft uneven flakes. Claire was right. It did not start at Christmas. The signs had been there for years, hidden inside small moments I kept excusing because I wanted peace more than honesty. I remembered the first Thanksgiving after Daniel married. Brianna. I brought my homemade pecan pie, the same recipe Daniel used to beg for every year growing up. Brianna smiled politely when I arrived, then placed the pie untouched on a side counter while serving the dessert her mother brought instead. Another time, Daniel canceled our Sunday brunch 30 minutes before we were supposed to meet, because Brianna suddenly needed a quiet day. Yet later that evening, social media photos appeared showing the two of them at a crowded winery with friends. There was always an explanation, always a reasonable excuse wrapped neatly enough to make me question my own instincts. Claire reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. "I debated showing you this," she said carefully. Then she slid the screen across the table toward me. It was a screenshot from Brianna's private social media account. I recognized the living room from Christmas dinner immediately. The baby rested peacefully in Brianna's arms while dozens of comments filled the post underneath. One sentence caught my attention instantly. "Finally enjoying our first real family Christmas." I stared at those words for a long time. Real family Christmas. The comment section below was full of heart emojis and compliments about the decorations, the matching pajamas, the beautiful baby. Daniel had commented too. "Perfect night." My chest tightened slightly, but not from anger. It felt more like grief finally removing its mask. Claire watched my expression carefully. "I think she wants a family that starts with her," she said softly. "And everyone before her is supposed to fade into the background." I locked my phone screen and placed it face down on the table. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The grandfather clock near the hallway ticked steadily through the silence. Finally, I stood up and walked toward the living room. I picked up the tiny pink blanket from the couch and folded it carefully into a gift box beside the silver bracelet that still had not been given away. Claire remained quiet behind me while I closed the lid slowly. "Mom," she asked after a moment, "what are you going to do?" I looked toward the glowing Christmas tree that still stood in the corner. Even though the holiday was over, most people leave decorations up because they are too busy or too tired to take them down. I left mine up because part of me still had not accepted what that holiday revealed. "Nothing," I answered calmly. "At least not yet." But as I said the words, I realized something inside me had already started changing. For the first time, I was no longer trying to convince myself that Brianna's behavior was accidental. Once you finally see exclusion clearly, it becomes impossible to mistake it for misunderstanding ever again. January settled over the neighborhood with the kind of gray silence that made every day feel longer than it really was. The Christmas lights disappeared from rooftops one house at a time until the streets looked empty again. I finally took down my own decorations during the second week of the month. Each ornament felt heavier than usual as I wrapped it carefully in tissue paper and placed it back inside the storage boxes Richard labeled years ago in thick black marker. Fragile snowflakes. Living room garland. Evelyn's favorites. His handwriting still looked steady and confident, even after all this time. I kept one ornament out after packing everything else away. It was a small ceramic angel Daniel made in second grade with crooked gold wings and uneven blue paint across the face. Richard used to joke that it looked more like a tired pigeon than an angel, but every Christmas he still insisted on hanging it front and center on the tree. I stood there holding it in my hand for several minutes before placing it gently inside the cabinet beside the fireplace. Later that afternoon, the house phone rang unexpectedly. Almost no one used the landline anymore except telemarketers and old friends. I nearly ignored it. "Hello," I answered quietly. "Evelyn." The voice on the other end stopped me cold for a second. It was Walter Green, Richard's attorney. I had not spoken to him since the funeral nearly 4 years earlier. "I hope I am not calling at a bad time," he said politely. Actually, there is something I have been meaning to discuss with you for quite a while. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table while snow tapped lightly against the windows. Walter explained that he was organizing several family trust documents Richard had updated shortly before his illness became serious. Most of the paperwork had already been finalized years ago, but a few items still required review now that Daniel had become a father. Your husband was very thorough, Walter said with a faint laugh. He believed strongly in protecting family assets across generations. Something about his wording stayed with me after the call ended. Protecting family. Richard had always spoken that way. Calmly. Carefully. Like a man building walls around the people he loved long before danger appeared. That night, I could not stop thinking about him. I walked upstairs and opened the cedar chest at the foot of my bed where I kept old letters, photographs, and documents too sentimental to throw away. Beneath a stack of faded vacation albums, I found one of Richard's old wool sweaters still carrying the faint scent of cedar and aftershave. I pressed it against my chest for a moment before sitting on the floor beside the bed. At the bottom of the chest rested a leather photo album we had not opened in years. I flipped through page after page slowly beneath the warm glow of the bedside lamp. Daniel learning to ride a bicycle. Claire holding a lemonade stand sign taller than she was. Richard standing proudly beside the lake house dock during summer cookouts while smoke from the grill drifted through the evening air. Every picture carried the same feeling. Warmth. Stability. Belonging. Then I found a photo from Daniel's college graduation. Richard had his arm around me while Daniel stood between us laughing at something outside the frame. I remembered that exact moment clearly because later that evening Richard pulled me aside during the restaurant dinner and said quietly, "Promise me something." I smiled at the memory even before hearing the words again in my head. Do not spend your life begging to stay where you already belong. At the time I thought he meant friendships. Maybe work. Maybe one of Claire's difficult relationships back then. I never imagined those words would someday apply to our own son. My eyes drifted toward the window beside the bed where snow covered the backyard in soft white silence. Richard always noticed things before I did. Looking back now, I realized he had never fully trusted Brianna. He was never rude to her. Never confrontational. But he watched carefully. During family dinners, he noticed when she interrupted me. He noticed when Daniel stopped calling as often after marrying her. Once, after they canceled another Sunday visit at the last minute, Richard simply folded his newspaper and said, "Some people do not join families. They replace them." I dismissed the comment immediately back then because it sounded too harsh. Richard only nodded and let the subject go. But sitting alone on the bedroom floor that January night, surrounded by old photographs and fading memories, I finally understood what he had been trying to protect me from. The painful part was not losing influence or control over my son's life. It was realizing someone had slowly convinced Daniel that loving his wife required distancing himself from the woman who raised him. And somehow, little by little, he had agreed. By February, the rhythm between Daniel and me had changed so quietly that an outsider might not have noticed it at first. The weekly phone calls became shorter. The casual messages stopped almost entirely unless they involved practical things. A question about tax records Richard once handled. A request for the name of our old furnace repair company. Information. Never conversation. I stopped being part of Daniel's emotional life and became something closer to an archived file cabinet he occasionally opened when necessary. One Tuesday afternoon, I stood in the laundry room folding towels when my phone buzzed with a message from him. "Hey Mom, any chance you could help with daycare costs this month? Things are tighter than expected." I stared at the screen longer than I should have. 4 years after Richard passed away, I helped Daniel whenever he needed it. Quietly. Without keeping score. I contributed toward their kitchen remodel when surprise plumbing issues doubled the cost. I paid for part of Brianna's maternity leave so she could stay home longer with the baby. Last summer, I even covered their property taxes after Daniel mentioned work bonuses had been delayed. I never viewed it as sacrifice. That is what family does when they love each other. At least that is what I always believed. But standing there holding a warm towel against my chest, I suddenly realized something uncomfortable. Brianna had no problem accepting my support. She only seemed uncomfortable accepting me. I typed a response slowly before deleting it twice. Finally, I sent a short message. I am not able to help financially right now. I hope things improve soon. Daniel responded almost immediately. Okay. No worries. No heart emoji. No love you. Nothing else. The conversation ended there. That evening, I sat alone in the den while rain tapped softly against the windows. The house smelled faintly like lavender from the candle burning near Richard's old reading chair. I opened the photo album again without meaning to. My fingers paused over a picture from Daniel's 10th birthday party. Richard stood behind the grill flipping hamburgers while Daniel laughed beside him wearing a paper crown from the party store. I remembered how proud Richard felt being able to provide those moments for our children. Stability mattered deeply to him because he grew up with very little. He used to say money was not about luxury. It was about freedom from fear. Around 7 o'clock, Claire called. You finally said no, did you? She asked before I could even greet her properly. Daniel told you? I asked quietly. No, she replied. But I know Brianna. I leaned back against the couch cushions while thunder rolled faintly outside. Claire sighed heavily before continuing. Mom, do you know what Brianna said at Thanksgiving when you left the room? I felt my stomach tighten slightly. No, I answered carefully. Claire hesitated for a second. She joked that you were basically their unpaid retirement plan. The room fell completely silent except for the rain against the windows. I closed my eyes slowly. Somehow that hurt more than the Christmas dinner. Not because it was cruel, but because deep down I already suspected it might be true. Claire, I said after a long pause, why did you not tell me before? Because Dad always handled this stuff when he was alive, she answered softly. And after he passed, you kept trying so hard to hold everybody together that I think you ignored things you should not have ignored. I looked toward Richard's chair again. Empty. Still. Untouched except for the folded blanket draped neatly across the armrest. Grief changes shape over time. At first, you mourn the person. Later, you mourn the protection they gave you without even realizing it. The next morning, Daniel called unexpectedly while I was grocery shopping. I answered near the produce section beside stacks of Florida oranges and red apples arranged in perfect rows. Hey Mom, he began, sounding unusually tense. I wanted to ask if you still planned on contributing to the baby's college savings account this year. There it was again. Not how are you? Not would you like to visit? Just another financial expectation sliding carefully into conversation as if emotional distance and financial closeness could somehow coexist forever. I stopped pushing my shopping cart and stared at the floor tiles beneath me. I have not made any decisions yet, I answered calmly. Daniel exhaled slowly on the other end. Okay, he muttered. Brianna is just trying to plan things. Brianna. Somehow every difficult conversation now carried her fingerprints on it. Every request, every boundary, every silence. I picked up a bag of apples and placed it gently into my cart before speaking again. Daniel, I said quietly, does Brianna even want me in your daughter's life? The line went silent for several seconds, long enough to tell me everything before he even answered. Mom, he finally said carefully, you know how protective she is. I smiled faintly to myself right there between the grocery shelves because for the first time, I understood something clearly. Daniel was no longer defending what Brianna did. He was defending the version of peace he thought depended on allowing her to do it. March arrived with colder rain than usual and a tension I could feel even through the phone whenever Daniel called. The conversations had changed again after I stopped. Helping financially. At first, the distance between us grew sharper, almost defensive. Then slowly, something else started slipping through the cracks underneath his careful tone. Stress. One Friday evening, he called while I was trimming roses in the backyard. The sky hung low and gray above the neighborhood, and damp wind carried the smell of rain through the bare trees. Hey Mom, he said quietly after I answered. His voice sounded tired. Hi sweetheart. Are you busy? I looked down at the gardening gloves in my hands. Not particularly. There was a pause long enough for me to hear faint noise in the background. Cabinet doors closing. A baby crying softly somewhere farther away. Then Brianna's voice, muffled but tense. Daniel lowered his voice immediately after that. I just wanted to check in. I almost smiled at how unnatural the sentence sounded coming from him now. Once upon a time, Daniel used to call simply because he wanted to hear my voice during his lunch break. Back when Richard was alive, the three of us talked nearly every day. Small things, ordinary things, weather, football games, family dinners. Love lived comfortably in those little conversations. Now every word between us felt measured carefully, like someone trying not to step on broken glass. "How is the baby?" I asked gently. "She is good," he answered quickly. "Growing fast." Another silence followed. Then finally, "Daycare costs are honestly getting brutal." There it was again. Money entering the room before emotion had time to settle properly. I sat down slowly on the patio chair near Richard's old bird feeder while rain clouds darkened overhead. "I am sorry things are difficult," I said calmly. Daniel exhaled heavily into the phone. "Yeah." In the background, I heard Brianna speaking again, sharper this time. I could not make out the words, but I recognized the pressure inside her tone immediately. Daniel covered the phone briefly before returning. "Sorry," he muttered. "Things are just stressful lately." I stared across the wet lawn toward the fence Richard built himself 15 years earlier. Every board still stood perfectly straight because Richard believed things built carefully should last. "Daniel," I said softly, "are you happy?" The question surprised him into silence. I could feel it. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he gave the kind of laugh people use when they are trying to avoid honesty without technically lying. "Of course," he answered. "We are just adjusting to parenthood." But something underneath his voice sounded thinner than before. Worn down. Before hanging up, he asked if I planned to come for Easter dinner the following month. The invitation arrived awkwardly, almost forced. "Brianna thought it would be nice," he added quickly. I looked up at the darkening sky while cold wind brushed against my face. "I will think about it," I answered. That evening, Claire came over carrying Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine. She kicked off her shoes near the front door and immediately noticed my expression. "He called again, did not he?" she asked while unpacking containers onto the kitchen counter. "Yes." "About money?" "Mostly." Claire rolled her eyes and handed me a paper plate. "Mom, I need to tell you something before Easter." I looked at her carefully. "What is it?" She hesitated for a second before pulling out her phone again. "One of Brianna's friends posted photos from brunch last weekend," she explained quietly. "I think she forgot I still follow her account." Claire tapped the screen twice before sliding the phone toward me. The photo showed Brianna seated at a restaurant patio holding the baby while smiling beside two women I did not recognize. One of the comments underneath made my stomach tighten instantly. "Glad your mother-in-law finally stopped hovering all the time." Brianna had replied with a laughing emoji followed by 4 words. "Peace at last, honestly." I stared at the screen without speaking. Claire watched me carefully from across the table. "Mom," she said softly, "she never wanted closeness. She wanted convenience." Outside, rain began tapping steadily against the kitchen windows. Somewhere deeper in the house, the grandfather clock chimed 7 times. I placed the phone face down beside my untouched dinner container and folded my hands together slowly. The strange thing was that I no longer felt shocked. A few months earlier, those words might have shattered me. But now they only confirmed what I had already started accepting piece by piece. Brianna did not see me as family. She saw me as useful when I stayed quiet, helpful when I paid bills, and inconvenient the moment I expected emotional space in return. Claire reached across the table and squeezed my hand gently. "Dad saw this coming," she whispered. I nodded faintly because by then I knew she was right. Richard had understood something years before I did. Some people do not remove you from a family all at once. They simply reduce your place inside it so gradually that by the time you finally notice, everyone else has already adjusted to your absence. 2 weeks before Easter, I met Walter Green at his office downtown on a rainy Thursday morning. The building smelled faintly like old paper, polished wood, and coffee that had been sitting too long on a warmer. Walter looked older than I remembered. His silver hair had thinned considerably since Richard's funeral, and his glasses slid lower on his nose every few minutes while he organized folders across his desk. But his voice remained steady and precise, the same calm tone that once reassured Richard during complicated business deals and hospital paperwork. "Thank you for coming in, Evelyn," he said warmly as I settled into the leather chair across from him. Large windows overlooked the wet city streets below where umbrellas drifted through the rain like dark floating dots. Walter opened a thick file folder carefully before sliding several documents toward me. "Richard updated the family trust 6 months before he passed," he explained. "Most of the provisions are standard inheritance protections. However, there are a few clauses specifically related to future grandchildren." My fingers rested lightly against the edge of the paperwork, while uneasiness settled quietly into my chest. Richard had always planned ahead, sometimes almost excessively, but now I understood that what once seemed like caution had actually been foresight. Walter adjusted his glasses again before continuing. "Your husband established an educational trust fund for any future grandchildren. It is substantial." I blinked slowly. Richard never discussed exact numbers with me while he was alive because he handled most financial matters personally. "How substantial?" I asked quietly. Walter gave a faint smile. "Enough to fully cover private education, university tuition, housing assistance, and future investment growth for multiple generations if managed properly." I stared down at the papers in silence. Outside, rain streaked softly across the windows while distant traffic hummed below. "Daniel knows about this?" I finally asked. "Only partially," Walter replied carefully. "Richard instructed me to delay full disclosure until after the birth of Daniel's first child." Something about his wording made me look up immediately. "Why?" Walter hesitated for the first time since I arrived. Then he folded his hands together slowly across the desk. "Because Richard had concerns." My stomach tightened slightly. Walter opened another document and turned it toward me. Near the bottom of the page sat Richard's familiar signature in dark blue ink. Seeing his handwriting again nearly took my breath away. "One section of the trust includes a family continuity clause," Walter explained. "Your husband believes strongly that children benefit from maintaining healthy multigenerational family relationships. The trust therefore requires evidence of ongoing family inclusion and contact." I frowned slightly while reading the legal language. What exactly does that mean? Walter's expression softened carefully. "It means that if legal guardians intentionally isolate the child from immediate family members without cause, they can lose administrative control over portions of the trust." Silence settled heavily between us. I read the sentence 3 separate times before fully understanding it. Richard had anticipated this. Somehow, years before Christmas dinner, before the cold phone calls, before Brianna slowly pushed me toward the edges of my own family, Richard had already seen enough to prepare for it. Walter leaned back in his chair quietly. "Your husband never wanted conflict," he said gently, "but he believed financial support should strengthen family bonds, not reward the destruction of them." My eyes burned slightly, though I refused to cry there in that office. Richard knew me too well. He knew I would tolerate disrespect for far too long if it meant keeping peace around the people I loved. So he built protection into the only language he feared people might still listen to. "Consequences." Walter handed me another folder. "There is more," he said softly. "As primary trustee after Richard's passing, you currently retain significant discretion regarding distribution timelines." I looked up sharply. "Meaning?" "Meaning," Walter replied carefully. "Daniel and Brianna cannot access direct control over those assets unless you approve it." For several seconds, the only sound in the room came from rain striking the windows. My hands rested motionless against the paperwork while something shifted quietly inside me. Not revenge. Not satisfaction. Something calmer than that. Clarity. For months, I had felt powerless watching myself disappear from my son's life piece by piece while convincing myself endurance alone would somehow fix things. But sitting in Walter's office, I finally realized Richard had left me something far more valuable than money. He had left me leverage against disrespect disguised as family boundaries. Before I left, Walter walked me toward the elevator holding the umbrella he insisted I borrow. Just before the doors opened, he paused. "Evelyn," he said gently, "Richard once told me something during one of our meetings." I looked at him quietly. Walter smiled faintly before repeating the words slowly. He said, "If someone ever makes my wife feel unwanted in her own family, I hope they never expect her generosity to remain unlimited. The elevator doors closed softly between us a few seconds later. As I descended toward the lobby, I stared at my reflection in the mirrored wall across from me. For the first time in months, I no longer looked like a woman waiting to be invited back into her own family. I looked like someone finally beginning to understand her worth. Easter Sunday arrived warmer than expected that year. The snow had finally disappeared from the sidewalks and soft sunlight filtered through the maple trees lining Daniel's neighborhood as I parked outside his house just before noon. Children rode bicycles farther down the street while pastel wreaths hung from front doors all along the block. From the outside, everything looked peaceful, ordinary, exactly the kind of holiday scene families spend years trying to create. I sat in my car for a moment with both hands resting on the steering wheel. On the passenger seat beside me sat a cream-colored leather folder containing copies of the trust documents Walter prepared for me earlier that week. I looked at the folder briefly before picking it up and stepping out of the car. The smell of fresh-cut grass mixed with the faint scent of ham and baked bread drifting from nearby houses. For a second, an old memory surfaced unexpectedly. Richard carrying Easter baskets into the backyard while Daniel and Claire raced across the lawn hunting for plastic eggs hidden beneath flower pots and patio chairs. Back then, family gatherings felt effortless. Nobody measured affection. Nobody guarded access to love. Brianna opened the front door before I even reached it fully. The transformation in her expression almost startled me. Her smile looked warmer than it had in months. "Evelyn," she said brightly, "you made it." She leaned forward just enough to kiss the air near my cheek without actually touching me. Behind her, the house buzzed with soft conversation and the clinking of dishes. "Happy Easter," I replied calmly. Brianna stepped aside quickly. "Come in. Everyone is here already." The dining room looked beautiful in the careful way Brianna always preferred. Pale pink flowers sat in crystal vases across the table beside folded linen napkins tied with gold ribbon. A large glazed ham rested beneath the kitchen lights while soft jazz played from hidden speakers somewhere in the house. Daniel appeared from the hallway carrying the baby against his shoulder. He looked thinner than usual, more tired. But when he saw me, genuine relief flickered briefly across his face before disappearing again behind caution. "Hey Mom," he said quietly. "Glad you came." This time, neither he nor Brianna pulled away. When I stepped closer to the baby, Brianna actually adjusted the blanket slightly, so I could see my granddaughter's face more clearly. "She is getting so big," I whispered softly. The baby blinked up at me sleepily with wide blue eyes that looked painfully familiar to Richard's. For one dangerous second, emotion almost weakened my resolve. Then lunch began. Conversation floated around the table easily at first. Weather, neighborhood construction, Claire's recent work promotion. Brianna laughed often and touched Daniel's arm constantly while speaking, performing warmth with the precision of someone aware she was being observed. But underneath the polished surface, tension moved carefully through the room like a quiet draft nobody acknowledged openly. Halfway through dessert, Brianna finally shifted the conversation exactly where I expected. "Daniel and I have actually been looking at bigger houses lately," she announced casually while cutting a slice of carrot cake. "Now that the baby is growing, we really need more space." Daniel kept his eyes lowered toward his plate. Brianna continued smiling. "There is this beautiful place about 20 minutes north of here with a huge backyard and excellent schools." Claire glanced toward me silently from across the table. I took a slow sip of iced tea before answering. "That sounds expensive." Brianna laughed lightly. "Very expensive." Another pause followed. Deliberate. Waiting. Then Daniel finally cleared his throat. "We were hoping maybe the family trust could help offset some of the down payment eventually." There it was. The real reason for the sudden invitations. The softened tone. The carefully restored warmth. Around the table, everyone became strangely quiet. Even the baby monitor humming faintly from the kitchen counter seemed louder suddenly. I placed my napkin carefully beside my plate before reaching for the leather folder resting quietly near my chair. Brianna's smile faltered almost invisibly as I opened it. "Actually," I said calmly, "that is something I wanted to discuss today." Daniel straightened slightly while Claire folded her hands together in complete silence. I removed several documents and slid them gently across the table toward Daniel. Your father updated the trust before he passed away, I explained quietly. There are conditions attached to administrative access. Daniel frowned while scanning the pages. Brianna leaned closer immediately. The color drained from her face gradually with every line they read. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally, Daniel looked up slowly. Family inclusion clause? He asked faintly. I nodded once. Brianna's entire posture changed after that. The confidence disappeared first. Then the performance. What exactly is this supposed to mean? She asked carefully, though tension sharpened every word now. I held her gaze calmly for the first time since Christmas. It means your father-in-law believed children should grow up connected to their family, I answered. And he believed financial support should never reward intentional isolation. The room fell completely silent. Somewhere outside, children laughed faintly in a neighboring yard while spring sunlight drifted across the dining room table. Daniel stared down at the papers again as realization settled heavily across his face. Brianna opened her mouth as if preparing another explanation, another polished excuse wrapped in politeness. But for once there was nothing left to soften, because everyone at that table finally understood the same thing at exactly the same moment. Richard had seen the truth long before the rest of us ever dared to admit it. The drive home after Easter felt strangely peaceful. The late afternoon sun stretched across the empty roads while soft golden light settled over the neighborhood lawns and blooming trees. For the first time in months, my chest did not feel tight behind the steering wheel. I did not feel victorious either. Just calm. The kind of calm that arrives after finally seeing something clearly enough that you stop arguing with reality. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed tiny purple flowers beginning to bloom near the mailbox Richard built years ago. Spring had arrived quietly while I was busy grieving a version of family that no longer existed the way I remembered it. Inside the house, I placed the leather folder carefully on the kitchen counter and removed my shoes near the door. The silence around me no longer felt lonely. It felt honest. 2 days passed before Daniel finally called. His name appeared on my phone just after dinner while I was watering plants near the living room window. I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. Hi, Mom. His voice sounded exhausted. Hello, Daniel. A long pause followed immediately. I could hear him breathing softly into the phone like someone rehearsing difficult words internally before speaking them aloud. I did not know, he finally said quietly. About the trust. About Dad. I rested the watering can beside the window and sat down slowly on the couch. I believe that, I answered. Another silence settled between us. Then his voice lowered further. Brianna is upset. I almost smiled sadly at how predictable that sounded. I imagine she is. She thinks you embarrassed her. The sentence hung in the air for a moment. Somewhere outside, birds chirped softly in the evening trees while sprinklers clicked rhythmically across neighboring lawns. I leaned back against the couch cushions and closed my eyes briefly. Daniel, I said calmly, being confronted with consequences is not the same thing as being humiliated. He did not respond immediately. For once he seemed to be listening instead of defending. Mom, he said after a while, did you really feel pushed away? The question hurt more than everything else combined because it revealed how completely he had stopped seeing what stood directly in front of him. I looked across the room toward the framed photograph above the fireplace. Richard smiling beside me during our 40th anniversary dinner. Stable. Protective. Present. Your wife would not let me hold my granddaughter at Christmas, I answered softly. And you stood there pretending that was normal. Daniel inhaled sharply but remained silent. I continued before emotion could interrupt me. I spent months convincing myself I was imagining things because I did not want to lose my son. But eventually, reality becomes too consistent to ignore. The line stayed quiet for so long I wondered if he might hang up entirely. Then, finally, his voice cracked slightly. I am sorry. I stared down at my hands resting in my lap. For years, I imagined hearing those words would heal something inside me instantly. Instead, they simply arrived too late to erase what already happened. I know you are, I answered gently. But apologies do not automatically rebuild trust. After we ended the call, I walked upstairs and opened the cedar chest again. Inside rested the silver baby bracelet and the tiny pink blanket still folded neatly in tissue paper. I picked them up carefully and carried them downstairs into the living room. The next Saturday morning, Daniel arrived alone carrying the baby in her car seat. When I opened the front door, he looked nervous in a way I had not seen since he was a teenager preparing to confess something difficult. "Brianna stayed home," he said quietly. I nodded once and stepped aside without commenting further. The baby had grown since Christmas. Tiny wisps of pale blonde hair curled softly near her ears while her blue eyes moved curiously around the room. Daniel placed the carrier gently near the couch before standing awkwardly beside it. "Mom," he said softly, "would you like to hold her?" The question nearly broke my heart because it should never have required permission in the first place. Still, I stepped forward carefully and lifted my granddaughter into my arms for the very first time. She felt impossibly warm against my chest. Small, innocent, completely unaware of the tension adults create around love. Tears burned my eyes briefly, but I blinked them away before they could fall. Daniel watched quietly from across the room while morning sunlight drifted through the curtains beside us. "Dad would have loved her," he whispered. I looked down at the baby sleeping peacefully against me and thought about Richard for a long moment. He would have loved her deeply. But more importantly, he would have protected the people he loved from becoming strangers to one another. That was always the difference between Richard and the rest of us. He understood that families do not fall apart all at once. They erode slowly through tolerated disrespect, unspoken silence, and people choosing comfort over courage. As I rocked my granddaughter gently in the quiet living room, I finally understood something painful but necessary. Blood may create a family, but respect is what allows people to remain inside one.